Oh, Latin too. I almost forgot to make this video, but getting ready to make a video on subjunctives, and it's kind of important that you watch this one before you watch the one on subjunctives. I don't mean the introduction on subjunctives, I mean the other one on subjunctives. Well, depending on when you watch this, there may be a whole bunch of ones on subjunctives, but it is relatively important that you watch this before the one on imperfect and pluperfect subjunctives. All right? And already, I mean, just the fact that it's on infinitives, you might be saying, why do I need to learn about this? This is a Latin 1 topic. And sure enough, I have a video on infinitives from Latin 1. And, I'm just, showing, the Latin 1 kids, which at one point was you, showing Latin 1 kids what those infinitives look like and, where they show up in the principal parts, how to use it in a sentence, easy stuff. Right? But then earlier in Latin 2, I also made another video on infinitives where I revealed that infinitives can be passive. Yeah, right? Right? If you didn't watch that, go watch it. If you didn't watch my present tense infinitives one, then I don't know what to tell you. But in fact, infinitives can be more than just passive. Infinitives actually have tense and voice. Now, they're not finite verbs, right? Like when I ask you guys to parse a finite verb, you can tell me the person, the number, the tense, the voice, and the mood. It's a whole bunch to tell me when it comes to a finite verb. But infinitives only have two things that change: their tense and their voice. So based on what I've already presented to you, you already know about the voice bit of that because you know about actives and passives. But every infinitive that you've seen up to this point have all been present. And to be fair, the vast majority of infinitives you will ever see will be present. That's why you have present active infinitives in your Latin 1 textbook, but you don't have any of the other infinitives in your Latin 1 textbook. It's because there are a lot of really basic situations in which you use present active infinitives. There are a lot of very common, very simple verbs, especially some of those early irregular verbs, that almost always use an infinitive with it. You need infinitives to be able to complete those ideas. But you don't need all the infinitives, you just need the simplest infinitives, which are the present active ones. But that's not all there is to infinitives. So now we're going to add the rest, all right? We've already found out about present passive infinitives. So before I start showing you what they look like, let's first just find out which infinitives exist, all right? Because it's not every tense. It's actually just three of them: present, perfect, and future. I've got a big old X down there on the future passive. That's because they don't exist. Now, if you look up tables and junk online, you might find tables that have a future passive. I know what the discrepancy is, and I'm not saying that they're wrong. Neither should you assume that I'm wrong. There's some weird technical biz in there that you don't need to know or think about in Latin 2, all right? Just ignore any future passive infinitive nonsense until you can't ignore it, all right? And by the way, until you can't ignore it is basically until you're reading Caesar and AP Latin. Between now and then, you don't need to know or think about that, but arguably, that doesn't exist. But the other five definitely do. So we're going to learn the other five, and two of them you already know. So I'm going to use a random verb. I probably could have chosen a better verb than this one, but I felt like getting off the beaten path a little bit, so I decided to take the shaken path and give you the verb to shake. I know I usually use amo amore, but I felt like doing something different. So why not shake? Maybe this will get watched by somebody who doesn't live where I live, where earthquakes are common, and they'll realize immediately that this is probably where we get the word quake. Hey. Anyway, but yeah, when you look at the principal parts already, you immediately see one of the five infinitives, quatere. Now, the infinitives you don't already know are basically going to be taking these principal parts and adding essa to it. But if I go and put these principal parts into the table that I just showed you, well, first we start off with our present, the present active, which is just quatere, which we're already given. Cool. And then to make it passive, we switch out the ERE for an I. Now, caveat here, I did pick a third conjugation. If you want to see the full, switching out for an I thing, you may need to review the present passive infinitive video, right? Because not all verbs are third conjugation. But, you can go watch that video and relearn that rule separately. All right? So that's what you do for the present, active and passive. We already know about that. Here's the new stuff. If you want to make a perfect infinitive, well, for the active, you take the perfect stem. That's this third principal part here, right? You take your third principal part, perfect stem, which is what we do for all perfect active things, and you basically squish the word essa into it to make one word. And that's how you get quasissa. It's literally just quasi and essa squished together into a single word. And then you'll translate that as to have shaken, right? All infinitives get translated in English with a to. To is how we show the infinitive in English. And if it were just present active, it would just be to in the verb. Done. When it's passive, you have to add a to be in there, to be shaken. If it's perfect, you have to add a have in there, just like you would for a finite verb, but still with to in front of it. To have shaken. Well, if you're going to make it perfect and passive, well, of course, we start with the supine stem, right? That's our fourth principal part over here. So we'll have our supine stem, and then we'll add essa, but as a second word, as a separate second word, just like we would do again with a finite passive verb, right? We would have like est or sunt or something, right? And so we'll have our to because it's an infinitive, have because it's perfect, and a been because it's passive, then our shaken. Now, for this last bit, you may have to also reference my future participle video, which I need to double check. I think doesn't exist yet, but it will. For the future, which, actually, for where we are in the textbook at the time I'm filming this, we don't have the future yet, but we will, and I'm afraid that if I don't deal with this now, I'll forget. So I'm going to go ahead and put the future in here as well. But for the future, you basically follow the same rule as you do for the perfect, where quasis on its own would be like a perfect passive participle. Adding essa makes it a perfect passive infinitive. For the future, you're going to take the future active participle, which is quasurus, and then add essa. Now, I did go ahead and put the literal translation here, but it's a little nonsense when you think about it. To be about to shake. That is literally essa with quasurus, but the fact is you're not going to need to say that. You're really only ever going to use that in something called an indirect statement, and that is definitely a video that's coming out later, okay? But if you need to see that form, here it is, all right? And we'll review that then when we learn about indirect statements. And actually, that's sort of true of the perfect ones as well. You're mostly going to use the perfect infinitives in indirect statements. And that probably isn't very clear right now because we haven't learned the indirect statement yet. That said, you could see these in regular old sentences. They're not as ridiculous as the future, and you totally could see or use these in a regular sentence. Here, let me give you an example, right? A real simple example of a sentence with an infinitive in it would be like this. Soon, I want to eat. Right? Real simple, real clear. Soon, I want to eat. We have seen a ton of sentences just like this one. And there are a bunch of real simple examples I could have used. I just picked this one, right? Well, in the exact same kind of example, you could put a perfect infinitive, right? Already, I want to have eaten. Now, you're less likely to say that. But it's not impossible to say and not, impossible to understand either, right? That I want a thing to have happened already rather than wanting it to happen now. And that's all it does, is it's just an infinitive that happens before the main verb, whereas this infinitive happens at the same time or, in a sense, immediately subsequent to the main verb. That's all the different tenses of the infinitive does, is it just shows the relationship to the main verb. Same as I talk about in the participle videos. So you could totally use this in a regular old sentence that would use an infinitive. That said, the perfect infinitive is not going to show up in a sentence like this anywhere nearly as often as just a regular present infinitive. And that's why we haven't learned it already. But they will show up a ton in indirect statements. So for the time being, pause on this topic, and we'll come back to it when we get to indirect statements. But you're definitely going to want to know those forms and have seen them when it's time to do subjunctives, which is basically now. All right. Good luck, guys.